They say dead men tell no tales, but Arthur Sterling left behind a $50 million ghost. At 66, I thought I was a widow. By the time the will was read, I realized I was the only person left standing between his children and a prison cell. They took the gold, I took the key. They're about to find out which one is more dangerous. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Our goal is to show that no matter how much they try to dim your light, your truth will shine through and perseverance is always rewarded. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Sterling mansion struck noon, its rhythmic chime sounding like a funeral knell for Eleanor's dignity. Across the polished mahogany of the dining table, the same table where she had served 40 years of Christmas geese and birthday cakes, sat the three people she had helped raise, though they now looked at her with the predatory stillness of vultures. Julian sat at the head of the table, already occupying his father's seat. He was a man carved from ice and expensive tailoring, his silver hair slicked back with a precision that matched his ruthless corporate reputation. Beside him, Beatrice adjusted her designer glasses, her expression one of bored triumph, while Leo, the youngest, scrolled through his phone, already mentally spending the liquidation of the wine cellar. "The locks are being changed tomorrow at 12 sharp, Julian said, his voice as flat as a ledger. He didn't look at Eleanor, he looked at the sprawling garden outside, a garden she had planted with her own hands when he was still in prep school. "I've already contacted an estate liquidator for the furniture. Whatever you haven't cleared out by then will be considered abandoned property." Eleanor felt a cold tremor in her hands, which she hid beneath the table. 40 years, Julian, she whispered. "I was your father's wife for 4 decades. I was the one who stayed by his side during the 2008 crash while you were hiding in the Hamptons. I was the one who balanced the books that built your trust funds. And you were adequately compensated with a roof over your head and a Sterling credit card," Beatrice interjected, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. She reached into her Hermes bag and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, sliding it across the table like a tip for a waitress. "In fact, I checked the Greyhound schedules. There's a bus that goes through Blackwood Cove once a day. This should cover your ticket to that shack. Or whatever it is Arthur left you in that godforsaken fog." The cruelty of the gesture hit Eleanor harder than the legal papers had. She looked at the $20 bill, then at the 3 faces across from her. In their eyes, she saw the truth, they had been planning this since the day she married their father. To them, she was never a mother, never a guardian, and certainly never a Sterling. She was merely an interloper who had overstayed her welcome. "You knew," Eleanor realized, her voice gaining a sudden, forensic clarity. "The debts. The frozen accounts. You've been working with the lawyers for months to ensure the public estate was drained before Arthur's heart even stopped." Julian finally turned his gaze toward her, his eyes as cold as the Atlantic. Dad was getting soft. He was sentimental. "But the law is black and white, Eleanor. You're an accountant, you should appreciate the math. You're a liability we've finally written off." Eleanor rose slowly, her spine stiffening with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. She didn't take the money. She didn't scream. Instead, she walked upstairs to the master suite. She bypassed the jewelry box filled with the diamonds Arthur had bought for social galas, pieces that Julian had already inventoried for the estate. Instead, she packed a single, worn leather suitcase with her practical clothes. She took her private journals and, most importantly, the small, heavy iron key she had been handed at the will reading. As she walked down the grand staircase for the last time, clutching her suitcase and the weight of 40 wasted years, she stopped at the front door. She looked at her wedding ring, the only gold she truly owned, and twisted it once. "I hope the house treats you as well as you've treated me," she said to the empty foyer. Outside, the rain had turned into a thick, suffocating mist. Eleanor climbed into her 10-year-old sedan, the engine groaning as it turned over. Behind her, the lights of the mansion flickered as the security team Julian hired began their sweep. Eleanor didn't look back. She put the car in gear and set her sights on the coast, driving away from the debt of the past and toward a mystery she was finally ready to solve. The drive to Blackwood Cove felt like descending into a world that time had purposefully forgotten. As Eleanor's 10-year-old sedan groaned up the winding coastal highway, the vibrant greens of the Massachusetts suburbs gave way to skeletal trees and jagged gray cliffs. By the time she crossed the town line, a thick, salt-heavy fog had swallowed the road, reducing her world to the flicking rhythm of her windshield wipers and the pale glow of her headlights. Blackwood Cove was exactly as the stepchildren had described it, desolate. The main street was a collection of boarded-up bait shops and shingled houses leaning precariously against the wind. It was the kind of place where dreams went to be buried under the silt. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She was 66 years old, homeless, and chasing a ghost. In her mind, she had already braced herself for what lay at the end of the GPS coordinates, a rotting fishing shack with a leaking roof, a final, cruel joke from Arthur to match the debts he had left in her name. Just a place to sleep, Eleanor, she whispered to the empty car, her voice cracking. Just a place to think. The GPS chirped, directing her off the main road and onto a private gravel track that seemed to lead directly into the maw of a dense forest. The trees here grew thick and twisted, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. She checked the address on the hand-scrolled paper again. According to the map, she should have reached a clearing by now, but all she saw was a wall of green. Then, the headlights hit it. Rising out of the fog was a massive, 12-foot-high perimeter wall. It wasn't the crumbling stone of a colonial ruin, it was a formidable barrier of dark, slate-gray basalt, completely draped in meticulously maintained ivy. It stretched into the woods as far as the eye could see, a silent sentinel that looked more like a fortress than a property line. Eleanor pulled the car to a halt, confused. The GPS insisted she had arrived, but there was no shack here. She stepped out of the car, the cold sea air biting through her thin cardigan. Her sensible shoes crunched on the gravel as she approached a break in the wall, a set of heavy, industrial steel gates. She looked for a padlock, expecting a rusted chain. Instead, she found a sleek, brushed metal pillar topped with a modern glass keypad that hummed with a faint, blue ultraviolet light. "This can't be right," she muttered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the worthless iron key. It looked absurd in this high-tech setting, an antique relic in a digital world. But as she stepped closer to the pillar, intending to look for a hidden keyhole, the keypad suddenly chirped. A soft, mechanical whirring filled the air. To her absolute shock, the iron key began to glow with a faint amber light from a tiny, microscopic chip embedded beneath the rust. The modern pillar turned green, and a synthesized voice, one that sounded hauntingly like Arthur's digital assistant, spoke into the fog. "Access granted. Welcome home, Eleanor." The heavy steel gates didn't creak, they slid open with a silent, hydraulic grace, revealing a driveway of smooth, heated obsidian that cut through the mist. Eleanor stood frozen, the heavy key vibrating in her hand. The worthless inheritance hadn't been a shack at all. It was a secret, and the gates were finally inviting her in. Eleanor drove the sedan through the opening gates, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The obsidian driveway was heated, melting the encroaching frost before it could even settle, winding through a forest that felt more like a curated gallery of ancient oaks than a wild wood. Then, the trees thinned, and the shack Arthur had left her finally came into view. Eleanor slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet surface. Before her stood an architectural marvel of glass, blackened steel, and cantilevered concrete. It didn't sit on the land, it seemed to float above the jagged cliffs of Blackwood Cove. It was a glass house, a structure so transparent it seemed to invite the forest inside, yet so sharp and modern it felt like a futuristic fortress. This was the Invisible Fortress, a multi-million-dollar masterpiece that appeared on no public records, mentioned in no social circles, and completely shielded from the prying eyes of the Sterling children. She stepped out of the car, the silence of the cove broken only by the rhythmic, thunderous roar of the Atlantic below. Trembling, she approached the front entrance, a 10-foot door of solid smoked oak. As she neared, a small indentation in the wood pulsed with the same amber light as the microchip in her key. She pressed the iron key into the slot, and the door didn't just unlock, it retracted into the wall with a soft, pneumatic sigh. Eleanor stepped inside and gasped. The air was warm, smelling faintly of cedar and expensive leather. Despite the cold, gray exterior of the cove, the interior was a sanctuary of light. White marble floors stretched toward walls made entirely of frosted, opaque glass that obscured the view but let in a soft, ethereal glow. The furniture was minimalist and bespoke, pieces that an accountant's eye knew cost more than the Brookline mansion's entire library. In the dead center of the vast, open-plan living area stood a single, minimalist pedestal made of brushed titanium. It looked out of place, a solitary sentry in the middle of the room. Eleanor approached it tentatively. Her reflection in the polished metal showed a woman who looked aged by grief, her hair windblown and her eyes weary. She thought of Julian's sneer and Beatrice's $20 bill. She thought of the debts she supposedly owed. With a shaky breath, she reached out and placed her palm on the cold surface of the pedestal. The house hummed. It started as a low-frequency vibration beneath her feet, a digital heartbeat awakening. Suddenly, a series of soft, mechanical clicks echoed through the rafters. The opaque glass walls began to shimmer. In a fluid, cinematic motion, the frost-like tint vanished, the glass turning crystal clear in an instant. The world exploded into view. Eleanor found herself standing on the edge of the world. The house hung directly over the cliff's precipice, and through the now transparent walls, the magnificent, violent beauty of the Atlantic Ocean flooded the room. Massive white-capped waves crashed against the rocks 100 feet below, sending plumes of spray into the air that caught the fading afternoon light. The horizon was a bruised purple, vast and unending. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, her knees nearly giving out. The house hadn't just woken up, it had transformed into a lens through which the entire world looked different. On the pedestal, a holographic display flickered to life, projecting a spinning golden seal, the Sterling family crest, but modified with a forensic magnifying glass at its center. This wasn't a place to hide. It was a vantage point. For 40 years, she had lived in a house built by Arthur's past, under the shadow of his children's resentment. But as the lights of the glass house adjusted to the darkening sky, Eleanor realized she was standing inside his greatest secret. The worthless shack was a high-tech command center, and for the first time in her life, she was the only one with the code. The hum of the house deepened, a resonant vibration that seemed to settle into Eleanor's very bones. From the center of the titanium pedestal, a lattice of sapphire light shot upward, weaving together with dizzying speed until a shimmering, three-dimensional figure stood before her. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. It was Arthur. But it wasn't the frail, graying man she had buried a week ago. This was the Arthur of 15 years ago, his shoulders broad, his eyes sharp and filled with that restless, visionary spark that had first drawn her to him in 1986. He sat in a virtual recreation of the very chair Eleanor was standing near, looking remarkably solid. "Hello, Eleanor," the image said, his voice rich and steady, stripped of the raspy breath of his final months. "If you're seeing this, it means the wolves have finally bared their teeth. It means Julian, Beatrice, and Leo have done exactly what I feared they would, tried to erase you the moment I was gone. The recording paused, the hologram's eyes seeming to search hers with a haunting intelligence. I have to apologize for the cruelty of the last few days, Arthur continued. To the world, I died a bankrupt man. I spent the last 5 years carefully eroding my public estate, leaking rumors of bad investments and racking up debts that made my accounts look like a sinking ship. I knew the children were watching. I knew they were already siphoning funds, embezzling from the firm, and waiting for my heart to fail so they could pick the bones clean. He leaned forward, his digital hands clasped. They think they won, Eleanor. They think they inherited the gold and left you the bill. But what those 3 greedy fools never understood is that wealth isn't just numbers in a ledger, it's how you hide them. Those millions in debt. They aren't real. To an amateur, they look like bankruptcy. But to a forensic accountant, to my Eleanor, they are a trail of breadcrumbs. Arthur's image gestured, and a complex web of financial data projected onto the glass walls of the living room, overlaying the crashing waves of the Atlantic. I created the phantom debt as a firewall. By claiming those liabilities, the children legally tethered themselves to a sinking public entity. Meanwhile, I moved the true heart of the Sterling Empire into the shadows. Only someone with your specific eye for detail could look at those collection notices and see the encoded routing numbers. Follow the debt, Eleanor. Every dollar they think I lost was actually moved into a private offshore trust, the Blackwood Fund. The holographic Arthur stood up, walking toward the glass. There is $50 million waiting for you, debt-free and untraceable by their lawyers. But more than that, this house is a repository. In the digital vaults below your feet, I've kept the black box, every audit, every forged signature, and every kickback Julian and his siblings ever took. I didn't leave you a burden, my love. I left you the throne, and the power to bring their world down if they ever dared to touch you. His image began to flicker, the sapphire light softening. I loved you in silence to keep you safe. Now, it's time for you to speak. Use your mind, Eleanor. Remind them why you were the only partner I ever truly had. The hologram vanished, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast, glowing sanctuary. The waves continued to roar outside, but the sound no longer felt like a threat. It sounded like a drum roll. Eleanor turned back to the pedestal, her fingers hovering over the interface. The grief was still there, but beneath it, the brilliant, calculated mind of the accountant was waking up. Arthur hadn't just left her a house, he had handed her the ledger of her life, and for the first time in 40 years, the balance was finally in her favor. The first 48 hours inside the glass house were a blur of blue light and rhythmic clicking. Eleanor didn't sleep. She fueled herself on the adrenaline of discovery and the high-end espresso machine that had hummed to life in the kitchen. She had swapped her morning dress for a pair of oversized cashmere sweaters she found in a cedar closet and reclaimed her reading glasses. For the first time in 4 decades, the forensic accountant was back in her element. The black box system wasn't just a computer, it was a digital vault that mirrored Arthur's obsession with order. Using her thumbprint and the unique encryption code hidden within the phantom debt notices, Eleanor bypassed layers of security that would have baffled a government agency. At first, she focused on the money. She watched, fascinated, as her fingers traced the movement of funds. Arthur had been a genius of misdirection. Every loss reported to the children had been a strategic transfer. The $50 million in the Blackwood Fund was real, sitting in a triple-layered offshore account that required Eleanor's biometrics to move a single cent. But as the third night fell over the Atlantic, she discovered the folder labeled the insurance ledger. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, her eyes widening behind her lenses. You were more than a visionary. You were a spy. She began to open the files, and the true extent of the stepchildren's betrayal laid itself bare. Julian, the corporate saint, had a folder dedicated to a series of insider trading maneuvers that had nearly crippled 3 of Arthur's subsidiary companies. There were recorded conversations, dated and time-stamped, of Julian discussing the old man's expiration date with competitors. Beatrice's file was even more damning. The woman who had mockingly offered Eleanor a $20 bill had been operating a network of shell companies to embezzle from the family's charitable foundations. Eleanor saw the wire transfers, the forged signatures that had been digitized for safekeeping, and the paper trail that led directly to Beatrice's secret lifestyle in Zurich. Even Leo, the supposed, confused, youngest, had a digital trail of scandals, hush-money payments to cover up vehicular accidents and legal bribes that Arthur had quietly paid for, all while keeping the receipts. Eleanor leaned back in the ergonomic leather chair, the glow of the screens reflecting in her eyes. The weight that had been crushing her chest since the funeral, the weight of humiliation and wasted years, finally evaporated. She looked at the sprawling data across the glass walls. Arthur hadn't left her a burden to carry or a shack to hide in. He had spent 40 years building a guillotine, and he had handed Eleanor the rope. The debts the children thought they had saddled her with were actually the legal shackles that tied them to the very crimes detailed in these files. By seizing the assets of the public estate, they had legally inherited the liabilities of their own fraud. She wasn't a victim of her husband's secrets. She was the executioner of his justice. Eleanor reached for her coffee, a cold, predatory smile touching her lips. For 40 years, she had been the silent backbone of the Sterling Empire. Now, she was going to be its reckoning. While Eleanor operated in the serene, high-tech silence of Blackwood Cove, a financial hurricane was leveling the Sterling name back in the city. The 3 heirs, who had spent the week after the funeral popping champagne and arguing over floor plans for the Brookline mansion, were suddenly facing a reality that no amount of pedigree could soften. It started with a frozen credit line at Julian's private bank. By noon, Beatrice's shell companies were flagged by federal regulators for irregularities tied to the very estate accounts she had fought to control. By evening, the liquidated assets they had so greedily snatched up were being slapped with emergency liens. Arthur's phantom debt was no longer a ghost, it had become a physical weight. Because they had insisted on a full, immediate distribution of the public estate, signing the legal documents that transferred all assets and liabilities to their names, they had inadvertently walked into a financial snare. The millions in debt Arthur had meticulously manufactured were now legally theirs. The creditors weren't knocking, they were breaking down the doors. It's a glitch. It has to be a glitch. Julian screamed into his phone as he paced the marble foyer of the mansion. His silver hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit jacket lay discarded on a chair. The old man was a venture capitalist, not a gambler. How can there be a $40 million shortfall in the Cayman accounts? Julian, the auditors are downstairs, Beatrice hissed, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched a stack of seizure notices. They're taking the art. They're taking the cars. They say that debts are tied to our personal holdings now because of the indemnity clauses we signed to bypass Eleanor. It's that woman, Leo muttered, staring at a tracking app on his tablet. She's not at a bus station. She's at that shack in Blackwood Cove. The GPS on her old car hasn't moved in 4 days. Julian's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, desperate malice. The property. That worthless acreage. It was the only thing Arthur didn't put into the public ledger. If it's private land, it's unencumbered. If we can seize it and flip it to a developer, we can cover the first wave of collections. They didn't wait for lawyers. Driven by the primal panic of the newly poor, the three of them piled into Julian's remaining SUV and raced toward the coast. They expected to find Eleanor huddled over a kerosene heater in a rotting cabin, ready to be bullied into signing a quitclaim deed for a few $1,000s. 2 hours later, the SUV screeched to a halt in front of the 12-foot basalt wall of the Blackwood estate. The vultures peered through the salt-thick fog, but instead of a shack, they were met by a high-tech fortress that pulsed with a soft, expensive blue light. Julian jumped out, storming toward the sleek metal gate. He hammered his fist against the reinforced steel, his face turning a blotchy red. "Eleanor! Open this gate. I know you're in there. Break the keypad." Beatrice shrieked from the car, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Electronic trespass is a felony, Julian," a calm, amplified voice echoed through the hidden speakers in the wall. It was Eleanor. She sounded different, steady, cold, and entirely unimpressed. "But please, keep shouting. The local police are already on their way to discuss the irregularities in your inheritance. Open the gate, you thief." Julian roared. "That house belongs to the Sterling estate." "The Sterling estate is bankrupt, Julian," the voice replied with a chilling finality. "But I'm feeling generous. If you wait there, I might just let you in to see exactly what 40 years of domestic service actually looks like." The heavy steel gates of the Blackwood estate hissed open, and Julian led the charge, his face a mask of panicked rage. Beatrice and Leo scrambled behind him, their expensive shoes slipping on the obsidian driveway that was far too sleek for the shack they had expected. As they rounded the final bend of the forest path, the glass house hit them like a physical blow. This is impossible," Beatrice stammered, looking up at the cantilevered concrete and the vast, shimmering walls of steel and glass. "Arthur didn't have the liquidity for this. Where did the money come from?" "From the debts you so graciously inherited," a voice rang out, clear and resonant as a bell. Eleanor stood on the expansive glass deck, 100 feet above the crashing Atlantic. She was no longer the woman in the wilted morning dress they had kicked out of the Brookline mansion. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray suit she had found in the house's master suite, her white hair styled with severe elegance. In her hand, she held a slim, black tablet. She looked exactly like the woman who had once been the top forensic auditor in the state, because she was Eleanor. Julian roared, storming toward the stairs of the deck. "I don't know what kind of shell game you and my father were playing, but this property is Sterling land. You're trespassing on estate assets. We have a court-ordered seizure notice." Eleanor didn't flinch. She watched them reach the top of the deck, their breath ragged and their eyes wide with greed as they took in the high-tech interior behind her. "Julian, you always were a poor student of the fine print," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a calm, predatory authority. "You didn't come here to seize an asset. You came here to beg for a lifeline. Don't talk to us like that." Leo stepped forward, his face flushed. "You're a secretary who got lucky. Give us the codes to this place or we'll have you arrested for grand larceny." Eleanor sighed, a sound of genuine pity. "The only larceny here, Leo, is yours." She tapped a command on her tablet. Suddenly, the massive glass walls of the house, the very walls they were standing against, shimmered and transformed. They were no longer transparent, they became colossal, high-definition monitors. The first wall displayed a series of wire transfers highlighted in neon red. "Julian," Eleanor began, "these are the records of the $3 million you siphoned from the Sterling Employee Pension Fund in 2021. Arthur didn't miss it, he just archived it." Julian's face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. "And Beatrice," Eleanor turned to the next wall. A grid of forged signatures and shell company registrations appeared. These are the charitable grants you diverted to your offshore accounts in Zurich, totaling 5.4 million. It's a shame you used the Sterling family seal for the forgeries. It makes the federal case quite simple. Beatrice let out a small, strangled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. And Leo, Eleanor didn't even look at the youngest as a video file began to play on the third wall, a dashcam recording of a night Arthur had spent $500,000 to clean up. I believe the district attorney would find this footage of your hit and run quite illuminating. What do you want? Julian whispered, his voice cracking. Why are you showing us this? Because you were so eager to bypass me, Eleanor said, stepping into the center of the trio. In your rush to liquidate the public estate and seize Arthur's remaining cash, you signed an indemnity and assumption of liability agreement. You didn't just take the money, Julian. You took the crimes. By legally tethering yourselves to the public accounts to push me out, you became personally liable for every dollar of the debt Arthur created to mirror your own thefts. She looked at the crashing waves below, then back at them. The creditors are seizing your homes and your accounts because you are the ones who stole the money. The 40 million in debt is your own embezzlement coming home to roost. You aren't just broke, you're legally radioactive. The silence on the deck was absolute, save for the roar of the ocean. The three heirs, who had spent their lives looking down on the woman who served their dinners, were now staring at their own destruction. The police are 10 minutes away, Eleanor said, checking her watch. You can leave now, sign the total waiver of interest in the Sterling name, and I might, just might, decide not to hit send on these files to the SEC. You'll be poor, Julian. You'll be ordinary. But you'll be free. Julian looked at the glass walls, at the digital evidence of his ruin, and then at the woman he had called adequately compensated help. He realized, far too late, that his father had never loved him enough to protect him from himself, but he had loved Eleanor enough to give her the world. Give me the papers, Julian whispered. Eleanor handed him the digital stylus. One by one, they signed away their lives, their greed finally silenced by the cold, hard math of a woman who knew exactly what they were worth, nothing. The pen scratched against the digital tablet with a sound like bone scraping on stone. One by one, Julian, Beatrice, and Leo signed the ironclad non-disclosure agreements and the total waivers of interest. They weren't just signing away their claim to the Blackwood estate, they were signing away their right to the Sterling name, their social standing, and the very air of superiority they had breathed for 40 years. As the last signature was time-stamped, the holographic displays on the glass walls flickered and vanished, plunging the deck into the soft, natural indigo of the coastal twilight. The evidence was tucked away back into the black box, a silent sword Eleanor held over their heads. Get out, Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't raised in anger, it was simply a statement of fact, as final as a closing balance sheet. They left without a word. Julian walked with a heavy, stumbling gait, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his own phantom debts was physically crushing him. Beatrice didn't look back at the architectural masterpiece she had coveted, and Leo followed like a ghost, his bravado entirely drained. As their SUV pulled away, the heavy basalt gates of the estate hissed shut, sealing them out of Eleanor's world forever. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever heard. She walked to the edge of the glass railing, the salt spray cooling her face. The Atlantic was a churn of dark mercury below, vast and indifferent to the squabbles of greedy heirs. For 40 years, Eleanor had lived in the service of a man's public shadow. She had been the quiet secretary, the trophy wife, and the domestic help. But as she stood in the center of Arthur's secret empire, she realized she was finally none of those things. She tapped her tablet, bringing up the $50 million trust account. It was a staggering sum, a fortune built on the very forensic skills she had suppressed to be a good wife. She knew exactly what she was going to do with it. The Sterling Sanctuary, she whispered to the wind. This house wouldn't be a trophy, and it wouldn't be a grave. It would become the headquarters for a foundation dedicated to women just like her, women whose labor had been erased, whose identities had been subsumed by powerful men, and whose golden years had been threatened by the greed of those they had nurtured. She would hire the best legal and forensic minds to hunt down the assets of discarded wives and mothers, ensuring that no woman would ever have to stand in a rain-slicked cemetery feeling like her life was a financial lie. Eleanor walked back inside the warm, cedar-scented living room. On the titanium pedestal, a final image flickered into view. It wasn't a hologram this time, but a simple digital photograph of Arthur. It was a candid shot she had taken in 1986, the year they married. He was laughing, looking at the camera with a pride that she had always misinterpreted as pride in his own success. Now, she saw the truth. The separate accounts, the home office that was off-limits, the worthless property in Blackwood Cove, they weren't signs of distance. They were the blueprints of a fortress he had spent a lifetime building to protect the only person he ever truly trusted. His silence hadn't been a lack of love, it had been the greatest act of protection he could offer in a world full of wolves. Eleanor touched the screen, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I see you now, Arthur," she murmured. "And I've got the ledger from here." She turned off the lights, but the house didn't go dark. The moon rose over the Atlantic, its light pouring through the transparent walls, illuminating a woman who was no longer a widow, but a titan in her own right. Eleanor Sterling sat down at the master console, opened a new file, and began to write the first chapter of her own legacy. In Blackwood Cove, the fog was finally lifting.